Before we get into today's episode, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone listening around the world. It still genuinely amazes me how far this show has reached. So a few shout outs this week to Alex listening in Brisbane, Chloe in London, Marcus from New York, Erin tuning in from Edinburgh, Josh in Perth, and Aisha listening in Dubai. I've also seen messages come through from Noah in Toronto, Sophia in Barcelona, Daniel in Johannesburg, and Kira listening in from Dublin, which is incredible. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, send me a message and let me know where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how global this community is becoming. You can find me on all social media. That'll be at What They Hide Pod on everything. And you can always reach out via email, and that'll be in the show notes. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Leave a review, it really does help more people find the podcast. And share the episode with someone who loves true crime as much as you do. Alright, let's crack on with the show. This episode contains discussion of the death of someone under 18, disturbing circumstances and details that may be distressing to some listeners. The case also involves conflicting interpretations and may be upsetting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. A quiet school gym. The kind of place filled with noise, voices bouncing off the walls, shoes scraping against polished floors, the echo of everyday life. But on January the 11th, 2013, something inside that gym went unnoticed. Students moved between classes, teachers checked attendance, another ordinary Friday. And somewhere inside that building, 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson was making his way through the day. He had plans, a routine, people expecting to see him later. But at some point, Kendrick disappeared. No one saw him leave. No one reported anything unusual. No alarms, no immediate concern. Just a normal school day, continuing without him. When students returned the next morning, nothing seemed out of place. The gym stood exactly as it had the day before. Rows of equipment, wrestling mats stacked upright, tightly rolled, pressed together. The kind of objects you stop noticing after a while, until something draws your attention. At first, it was just a detail, small, easy to miss, a shoe, sticking out from the top of one of the mats. Someone looked closer, then called for help, and within minutes, the ordinary space began to change. Staff approached the mat, carefully, unsure of what they were about to find. The mat was heavy, rolled tight, standing vertically. And when they looked inside, they saw him. Upside down, head first inside the mat, feet toward the ceiling, body tightly compressed. It was Kendrick Johnson. Police were called. The gym was cleared, and almost immediately questions began to form. How had he gotten inside that mat? Why hadn't anyone noticed? And how could something like this happen? In the middle of a school, during a normal day? Investigators began reconstructing what might have happened. Students later explained that it was common to store shoes inside the rolled mats, a way to keep them hidden, safe. The theory was simple. Kendrick had reached inside to retrieve a shoe, but something went wrong. He slipped, and once he was inside, there was no way out. trapped, upside down, unable to free himself, and in that position, he died. An accident. That was the official explanation. Because for Kendrick's family, the explanation didn't make sense. There were questions about the injuries, about the timeline, about what had and hadn't been seen. And those questions would not go away. They would grow louder, more urgent, more public. What began as a tragic discovery inside a high school gym would become something far more complicated. A case that divided opinion. A case that sparked protests. A case that refused to settle into a single version of the truth. Because sometimes what's found isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of something much harder to understand. Kendrick Johnson, a high school gym, and a case that for more than a decade later still leaves people asking the same question. What really happened? This is What They Hide. Hidden crimes in plain sight, and this is the tragic mystery of Kendrick Johnson. Before the gym, before the questions, before the headlines, there was just a normal day. A house, a routine, a family who expected everything to unfold the way it always had. Kendrick Johnson was 17 years old, a high school student in Valdosta, Georgia. He was known for being active, energetic, the kind of teenager who filled a room without trying. He played sports, spent time with friends, laughed easily. To the people who knew him, Kendrick wasn't defined by a single moment. He was defined by all the ordinary ones. And on the morning of January the 10th, 2013, it began like any other. Kendrick got ready for school. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. A normal morning in a normal home. There were no signs that anything was about to change. No sense that this day would become something his family would replay over and over again. Because that's the thing about days like this. They don't feel different when they begin. At Lowndes High School, students moved through the day as they always did. Classes, hallways, the rhythm of a school schedule. Somewhere within that routine, Kendrick was seen, walking through the building, moving between spaces, part of the same flow as everyone else. At some point, he entered the gym, and that moment would later become the centre of everything. Because after that, there are no confirmed sightings, no clear record of where he went, no one who can say with certainty what happened next. Just a gap. That gap is where the story begins to change, because for hours no one raised an alarm. No one reported him missing inside the school. No one noticed that something had gone wrong. The day continued. Classes ended. Students went home. And Kendrick Johnson never returned. At home, time passed. At first there was no immediate panic. Teenagers sometimes stay out longer than expected. Plans change. Phones aren't always answered. But as the hours stretched on, concern began to grow. Calls were made, questions asked, and slowly that concern became something else, because Kendrick wasn't answering. By that evening, his family knew something wasn't right. This wasn't normal. This wasn't routine. And as the night deepened, the absence became heavier. Because when someone doesn't come home, every minute begins to matter. When the next day began, there was still no sign of Kendrick. And while the school reopened, while students returned to their classes, something was already wrong. They just didn't know it yet. Because somewhere inside that building, inside a space filled with noise and movement and routine, Kendrick Johnson was still there, hidden, unseen. And it would take until that moment in the gym, that small detail, that shoe, for everything to change. Because sometimes the truth isn't far away. It's just waiting to be noticed. The gym at Lowndes High School isn't silent. It never really is. Even when it's empty, sound lingers. Echoes of movement, voices that have already passed through, the memory of noise. On the morning of January the 11th, 2013, students returned to that space. Another school day, another routine, and at first, nothing seemed out of place. Near the edge of the gym there were wrestling mats, large, heavy, rolled tightly and stored upright, pressed together in rows. Students had seen them countless times before. They were part of the environment, something you stop noticing until something changes. At the top of one of the mats, there was something visible, a shoe, just the tip of it, barely noticeable. At first it didn't make sense, then someone looked closer and everything shifted. Staff were alerted, the mat was approached carefully, it was heavy, awkward to move, and when they looked inside they saw him, Kendrick Johnson, his body positioned upside down inside the mat, head first, feet toward the ceiling, his arms pinned close to his body, the space tight, restrictive. It was a position that raised immediate questions, because it didn't look natural. It didn't look like something that should happen easily. Police arrived quickly. The gym was secured, students were removed. Investigators began examining the scene, trying to understand what they were looking at. There were no immediate signs of a struggle in the surrounding area, no clear indication of a wider disturbance inside the gym, just a body inside a mat, in a position that needed to be explained. As detectives began piecing together what might have happened, a theory began to form. Students later explained that it was common to store shoes inside the wrestling mats, a way to keep them hidden to stop them being taken. Investigators believed Kendrick may have done the same. The theory suggested he had reached inside the mat to retrieve a shoe, but the mat was narrow, deep, and once he leaned forward, something went wrong. He slipped, and with his body angled downward, gravity took over. The position of the body became central to the explanation. Head down, feet up. In that position, blood would move toward the head. Circulation became restricted. Breathing became more difficult. And without the ability to push upwards, without space to move freely, escape becomes almost impossible. The official conclusion was that Kendrick had become trapped, and that he had died as a result of positional asphyxia, an accidental death. The autopsy supported that conclusion. The findings stated that there was no evidence of a fatal blunt force trauma, no clear signs of a violent struggle. The cause of death was listed as accidental asphyxia. A tragic accident, a sequence of events that, while rare, could be explained. But something didn't sit right, because for many people, that explanation raised as many questions as it answered. the position, the time frame, the fact that no one had noticed. How could something like this happen in a school during the day without anyone seeing? Why hadn't he been found sooner? Why did certain details feel unclear? Those questions began quietly, then grew louder. For Kendrick's family, the explanation didn't make sense. They saw something different, something they believed hadn't been fully explained, and that belief would begin to shape everything that followed. Because this case would not end with a single conclusion. It would split into two versions of events, one grounded in official findings, and another driven by doubt. And once doubt enters a case like this, it doesn't leave easily. Next, the questions that refuse to go away, and the fight to uncover a different version of the truth. For investigators, the case had reached a conclusion. An accident, a sequence of events that, while tragic, could be explained. But for Kendrick Johnson's family, the story didn't end there. Because when they looked at what had happened, they didn't see an accident. They saw questions. Losing someone suddenly is devastating, but losing someone in a way that doesn't make sense is something else entirely. Because grief needs answers, and when those answers don't feel right, grief can turn into something sharper: determination. Kendrick's family began asking questions almost immediately about the scene, about the investigation, about what they believed had been missed, and those questions would soon become public. Unsatisfied with the official findings, the family sought a second opinion, an independent autopsy. The results would change the direction of the case. The independent examination concluded that Kendrick's injuries were not consistent with an accidental death. Instead, it suggested blunt force trauma. A different cause, a different story. And from that moment, two versions of events began to exist, one official and one that the family believed told the truth. The case began to attract attention, local at first, then national. Media coverage grew, and with it, public scrutiny. People began asking the same questions. How could this happen inside a school? Why were there gaps in the timeline? Why did the conclusions differ? One of the most discussed aspects of the case was the school's CCTV footage. Investigators reviewed hours of recordings, but there were gaps, periods where footage was missing or not captured. For authorities, this was explained as a limitation of the system, but for the family, it became another unanswered question, because in a case like this, every missing piece matters. Then came another revelation. During the second autopsy, it was discovered that Kendrick's organs had not been returned to his body. Instead, they'd been replaced with newspaper. This is a practice sometimes used in forensic examinations, but for the family, the discovery was deeply distressing, and it raised further questions about how the case had been handled. As the case gained attention, protests began. People gathered, spoke out, demanded answers. For Kendrick's family, this was no longer just about one investigation. It was about being heard, about making sure their son's story wasn't dismissed, about pushing for something they believed had not yet been fully uncovered. In response to growing pressure, the case was reviewed multiple times. State investigators, federal authorities, each time the findings returned the same conclusion. no evidence of homicide, no indication that the original ruling should be changed. The official position remained consistent, but the doubt remained too. By this point, the case had become something more than an investigation. It had become a divide between what was concluded and what was believed, between official findings and a family who refused to accept them. And for the public watching, it became something else again. A question. What happens when a case is closed, but it doesn't feel finished? For Kendrick's family, the fight never really ended, because uncertainty has a way of staying, of returning in quiet moments, of asking the same question again and again. What really happened? And when that question doesn't have an answer everyone agrees on, it lingers. And sometimes the hardest cases are not the ones with no answers. They're the ones with answers that not everyone can accept. Next, the evidence, the contradictions, and the case that continues to divide opinion to this day. By this point, the case had split in two. On one side, an official conclusion. On the other, a growing sense that something didn't add up. And in the space between those two versions was the evidence. The first autopsy had been clear. No fatal blunt force trauma, no evidence of a struggle, cause of death, positional asphyxia, an accident. But the second autopsy told a different story. Commissioned by Kendrick's family, conducted independently. It concluded that the injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, a different cause, a different interpretation. Two medical conclusions looking at the same body, reaching different answers. One of the most debated elements of the case was the presence of injuries. Some described as minor, some described as significant. For official investigators, these could be explained. Injuries caused during the fall, during the compression, or even after death. But for others, the injuries raised a different possibility, that something had happened before Kendrick entered the mat, something that had not been accounted for. Then there was the timeline, the gap between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery. Hours. Time in which no one reported anything unusual. No alarms were raised, no immediate search inside the gym. For investigators, this was a result of routine. Students moved constantly. People passed through spaces without being noticed. But for others, the timeline felt incomplete. Because in a place as active as a school, how could someone remain unseen for so long? The school's surveillance footage became another focal point. Hours of video reviewed, movements tracked, but there were gaps, not continuous coverage, not every single angle visible. For authorities, this was explained as a limitation of the system, cameras that didn't record constantly, blind spots. But for those questioning the case, the gaps became something else. Spaces where something could have happened without being captured. Then came the details that didn't sit comfortably. The positioning of the body, head down, feet up, arms restricted. A position that raised a simple question. If he entered the mat voluntarily, why hadn't he been able to pull himself out? Investigators argued that the design of the mat made escape difficult, that once inside, gravity and restriction made movement almost impossible. But others questioned that. Questioned whether a 17-year-old athlete could really become trapped without leaving clearer signs. There were no signs of a struggle in the surrounding area, no clear disruption, no overturned equipment. For investigators, that supported the accident theory. But for others, it raised another question. If something had happened, why wasn't there more evidence? Or was something simply missed? The discovery that Kendrick's organs had not been returned and had been replaced with newspaper added another layer to the case. For forensic professionals, this was not unheard of, but for the family, it felt like something had been taken, something that might have held answers, and once that doubt was introduced, it became difficult to remove. Over time, multiple agencies reviewed the case, state investigators, federal authorities. Each time the conclusion remained the same: no evidence of homicide, no indication that the original findings should be changed. The case remained classified as an accident. But the questions remained, because evidence does not always settle a story. Sometimes it complicates it. 2 autopsies, 2 interpretations, a timeline with gaps, a scene that raised questions, and a family who believed the truth had not been fully uncovered. There are cases where everything aligns, where evidence points clearly in one direction, and there are cases like this, where every answer seems to create another question, where certainty depends on what you choose to believe, and where closure feels just out of reach. For some, the case is a tragic accident, a rare and devastating sequence of events. For others, it's something else, something unresolved, something hidden, and that divide has never fully closed. Because sometimes the most unsettling stories aren't the ones where nothing is known. They're the ones where everything is known, and people still don't agree on what it means. Next, the official conclusion, the lasting impact, and the question that continues to follow this case. What happens when a story never settles? Some cases end with certainty, an answer, a conclusion, a moment where everything falls into place. This is not one of those cases, because more than a decade later, the story of Kendrick Johnson still feels unfinished. For his family, Kendrick is not a case. He is not a headline, not a theory. He is a son, a brother, a presence that should still exist in the everyday moments of life. The space at the table, the sound of his voice, the future that never had the chance to unfold. And when answers don't feel complete, that absence becomes something heavier, something that doesn't fade with time. The case has never settled into one version of the truth. Instead, it exists in 2. An official conclusion and a belief that something else happened. And between those 2, a divide that has never fully closed, because once doubt takes hold, it has a way of staying. Uncertainty is different from mystery. A mystery suggests something waiting to be solved. Uncertainty feels like something that may never be, because every piece of evidence in this case has been examined, reviewed, debated, and yet the same question remains. What really happened inside that gym? The gym still exists. Students still walk through it. The mats are no longer there, but the space remains. And for those who know the story, it's impossible to see it the same way. Because once a place becomes part of something like this, it never fully returns to what it was before. This is not just a story about one day or one moment. It's a story about what happens after the investigation ends, after the reports are written, after the official conclusion is given. Because sometimes that's when the hardest part begins. The living with it, the questions that don't go away, and the feeling that something is still missing. The most unsettling cases are not always the ones filled with darkness. They're the ones that sit in the light. A school, a gym, a normal day. Places where nothing should go wrong. And yet, something did. Kendrick Johnson walked into that gym and never walked out. What happened in the time between those two moments depends on who you ask. And maybe that's what makes this story stay with people. Not just what was found, but what wasn't. Not just the answers that were given, but the ones that still feel out of reach. Because the truth doesn't always hide in darkness. Sometimes it sits in plain sight, waiting, questioned, unresolved. And that is exactly what this show is about. The things people hide, the stories that don't settle, the cases that leave something behind. Not just evidence, but doubt. This has been What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. Stay aware, stay questioning, and remember, sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones that never find an ending.